Hello gamers, Powered Heal here, and today we're going to be doing the priest leveling guide for Classic WoW 2024. So this is going to be a long one. We're going to do timestamps in this one, and I promise we're actually going to do the timestamps this time because it's definitely going to be long, and I want people to be able to just kind of go through the guide at their own pace, pick out what they need, because some people may not need to obviously have all this information thrown at them. So yeah, we'll be doing that with the help of this notepad thing I have here. I made some notes I'm going to be talking about, and then also going to be talking about the specs quite a bit. So I have a bunch of specs up here that we'll go through. I have one for the 1 to 40 spec, and then at 40 to 60 things change. So you can either go holy or shadow, and I have a spec for when you first swap to shadow, spec for when you first swap to holy, spec for advanced shadow, spec for advanced holy. And then I have this blank calculator here so I can show you guys like the order of the points and everything and talk about maybe some theoretical differences, things you can do a little bit different in every build and stuff like that. So this is going to be quite comprehensive. Sit back and strap in. And we'll start right now. So the first thing I actually want to talk about is the race of your priest, because I think this is pretty important. And for new players, especially if somebody is like brand new to the game, it's definitely important that they hear about this, especially in the case of priest. And the reason why it's particularly important for priest is because most classes, they'll just get whatever racials the race that they pick has, but priest is a little bit different in that the race you pick not only gives the normal racials that race has, but it also gives you unique racials based on the race. So for example, dwarf will have something different than human, human will have something different than night elf, etc., and same on the horde side. So I kind of wanted to start off with the alliance. This is the one that's most clear cut, and dwarf is basically by far the best race for Alliance Priest. The reason for that is there's a spell called Fear Ward. Fear Ward is a 10-minute buff that I believe has a 30-second cooldown, and you can basically put it on a player, and the next fear that happens to them will be completely negated. Obviously, this is super powerful. It has really strong implications in both PvP and PvE. In particular, it's kind of powerful even early in the game because there's a lot of even dungeon mobs that do some fears and stuff that can, fears are never really that great to have in dungeons because when players are just running uncontrollably, and in some cases if the fear is a fear that's unable to be dispelled, which there are some of those in the game, even though they're not super common, they can run into packs of mobs and stuff like that. So even in the dungeon leveling experience, it's has the use cases at least, and then the first big raid you'll go into, or one of them being Onyxia, it's super useful in there. It's much more useful to have dwarf priests on alliance side versus to have shamans with tremor totem on the horde side. It's just a lot harder to make use of tremor totem effectively in most situations, where it's very easy to use Fear Ward because you just put it on your main tank, who's the most important person, and he doesn't get feared by Onyxia, which is huge. And you'll often have enough dwarf priests to rotate Fear Wards on the tank, so you'll never have him in a situation where he's getting feared by the boss, which is huge. You can probably even afford to have a specific healer get Fear Warded as well, and they won't get feared either, so you always have constant healing on him. Obviously, this extends well beyond just Onyxia into other raids as well, and it's just obviously incredible in PvP as well. So that's the big thing dwarf has over the other alliance races. Now, the next best thing I would say is Desperate Prayer. Desperate Prayer is basically an instant heal that it's quite strong, and it's instant. It costs 0 mana. It has a 10-minute cooldown, and it can only be used on yourself, but it's still incredibly strong for PvE, very, very strong for PvP, obviously. And dwarf shares this with human, so you can get Desperate Prayer if you go human as well. But obviously human doesn't get Fear Ward, so not quite as good there. And then the other main thing I wanted to talk about with dwarf is that you actually get Stone Form, which, a lot of people would maybe see that and not think that it's super great. but it's actually really strong in Classic in particular, especially in PvP. Because the fact that it removes poisons and that blind is actually a poison is huge, like Rogue Blind. And it doesn't just remove the poison, it's inactive, so it almost acts as like a trinket against blind, essentially, where if you get blinded by a rogue, you can just press the button and you instantly come out of the blind. And that's like very powerful, because if you, let's say that it was something that had to be popped like preemptively, right? Not only would it be more difficult to use for the player using it, obviously, but also if you use it preemptively and then the rogue blinds you, the rogue can immediately see that you use the cooldown, and therefore they can kind of like react to that right there, right then. But if the rogue thinks that you may have Stoneform on cooldown, or they're like unaware like about Stoneform in general, and they blind you and then go to do something else, and you immediately basically trinket out of it, they'll be very confused, and it's kind of like they planned all their actions around you being blinded, and now you've just come out of the blind. So it's like a lot worse if they don't recognize immediately that their blind did not work on you. So it's just a super strong ability, and it's fantastic in PvP in particular. So Dwarf Priest is like just really insane in PvP. And I normally don't say this about racials in this game, but I would say that out of many of the racials, this is the one case where you may actually receive flame if you don't play a Dwarf Priest on Alliance. Now, I'm not telling you that you have to play a Dwarf Priest or anything like that. Like, my thing is always play what you want. If the aesthetics of your character is a big thing for you, and you want to play a Night Elf or a human, go right ahead. But I will just warn new players that people on the Alliance side can be a little bit toxic about this. For sure, I've definitely seen it in game with like people, kind of flaming people for not being Dwarf Priests, because the power gap here is just so large. And if you're a new player, it might be hard for you to like kind of exactly understand what I'm talking about, but you just have to trust me on this, that the power gap is huge. So if you really care about character performance over other things, I would strongly consider going Dwarf. Otherwise, just do what you want and, shake the haters off, right? But so let's move on to the Horde side. And Horde basically has the Troll and Undead. And my personal opinion, Undead is just... well, I guess it sort of depends if you're playing on a PvE or PvP server. Or even if you are playing on a PvE server, rather, do you plan on doing any high-level instanced PvP like Battlegrounds or anything like that? Because I think in PvP, Undead is just clearly the better option in most cases. Having a Fear Break and Charm Break is very, very strong. And then on top of that, Devouring Plague is something that, in my opinion, is very underrated, especially in like 1v1 type matchups. I think it gets underrated because if you're playing in like a Warsong Gulch type setting, in a lot of cases, even if the you're not playing full 10v10, because obviously Warsong Gulch, how it plays out is like, usually all 10 people from each side are not in the same area at the same time. But even in those like split off groups, there's usually people who have a Dispel and stuff like that. So Devouring Plague in like an organized PvP setting, not really as strong because it costs a lot of mana, has a long cooldown, and it can just easily be invalidated by like a Paladin Cleanse or a Priest Dispel, something like that, right? It can just immediately get taken off, and then you spent all that mana for nothing. But against any target that can't cleanse it, or against like in any group PvP setting where the cleanse is not available, whether you CC the cleanser, kill the cleanser, or there's not a cleanser there to begin with, it's very, very strong, because not only does it add an additional dot, which is nice in vanilla, because like vanilla is a little bit different than retail, where some of the dot-oriented classes don't really actually have that many dots. So it's not like you're putting like 4 or 5 dots on the target in some cases, right? So getting another dot, more passive damage is really good. It also heals you, which is particularly good if you're Shadow, because you have a lot of damage mitigation as Shadow already. And now you're getting healed from from a dot, and then you also have Vampiric Embrace on top of that that's healing you more, right? And then also it does more damage when you're Shadow because of this talent right here, Shadow Weaving. So it should do like, I believe, what is it, 15% more damage? Yeah. So just really, really strong. And the other awesome thing about it is it does have a huge mana cost, but you can cast it with Inner Focus, which you should have usually like by the time you're close to max level and stuff like that. So that kind of really negates the huge downside of it, and it's just really good in small scale skirmish and 1v1s when it can't be dispelled. Moving on to Troll a little bit. Troll does have an interesting self buff for PvP, where basically they put something, I forget the exact name of it, it's a racial, but you put it on yourself, and then when somebody hits you, it deals damage back to them. It's not really that bad against some classes like Rogue. It has an internal cooldown, but the cooldown's not really that long, so it still does proc a decent amount. But outside of like specific matchups like that, you're just going to have a much better time, I think, PvPing, generally speaking, as Undead, especially in an organized type environment. And I would say that Troll is kind of known as like the PvE priest healer on the Horde because of Berserking. It is basically a cast speed buff. How it works is when you press the button for 15 seconds, you get 10% haste, and then the more damage you've taken down to 50% health, the stronger the buff effect gets. I believe it goes as high as like 30% haste. So at first like glance, this sounds like it could be really good, 30% haste on your spells. It is kind of a 2-minute cooldown, which is, a little bit rough considering some of the fights in this game are very short. They're 2 minutes or under, so you're only getting one use. But because the fights are very short, 15 seconds is also a larger percentage of the time you are in the fight. So something to keep in mind. So why do I still pick Undead though over the Troll PvE racial, quote unquote, right? Well, to me, this racial is like, it sounds kind of good on paper, but it's really hard to make use of, right? And the first reason is because it's sort of hard to just get your health to 50%, because obviously normally you don't want your health to be at 50%, right? Normally you want to be topped. So you have to kind of specifically try to lower your health in a lot of cases. And that can be kind of tricky, or it can be hard to play around. I'll give you some examples. So in Molten Core, a lot of the damage dealers in the raid, like mages and stuff like that play Troll, what they'll do is they'll go into the lava beforehand to lower their HP before a fight, right? They'll try to get to 50%, and they basically tell people, okay, don't heal me for the first 15 seconds. I want to get the full effect of my buff. And they'll basically go into the fight. They'll pop all their cooldowns. They'll pop Berserking. They'll get the max effect from it. And, then they have no issues really, right? The problem is that you can't really do the same thing as Priest in most cases and get the maximum effect from Berserking, because unlike with DPS, DPS wants to pop it at the start of the fight, right? Because that's when all their cooldowns are up, right? And they want to get like a big opener. It makes sense for them to use it right off the rip. For a Priest, usually you're not doing most of your big healing at the start of a fight. Usually there'll be a particular mechanic that comes out, or a phase thing that happens where you have to heal more after that. So you really want access to this Berserking buff on demand with a healer, whereas a DPS, that's not really as important, because there's not really many things in this game that need on-demand DPS. Even most of the ad spawns are relatively easy to kill with normal DPS. You don't really need to have classes hoarding cooldowns to kill them. So you're pretty much free to just use Berserking on the pull, and that makes it really easy to do like the MC Lava trick, or to just lower your health in other ways, right? But obviously, as a Priest, if you get your health to 50% before the fight, and you don't want to use Berserking on the pull, now you're just kind of sitting at 50% health, right? Until you want to use your button, and that makes you more vulnerable. Also, it's kind of hard to get people to not heal you as a Priest, because as a DPS, it's kind of a well understood thing if you play Horde side that some of these people are going to be, using a lava abuse or whatever to get their health to 50%. You don't heal them for the first 15 seconds. It's pretty common knowledge. Some people will take a little bit of getting used to if you've never played before, but when you go into a raid, you get used to the people. You know who's a troll after a while. You know who's trying to do the buff cheese and stuff like that. And it's very easy because it's just the first 15 seconds of the fight, right? But a priest that's like 50% HP, like 40 seconds into the fight, like are people really not going to heal him? There's also things like chain heal on Horde side, which just, they just heal people. And at that point, like the shaman's discretion in terms of who they're going to be using the chain heal on is probably not super high because, again, all the DPS players have gotten the benefit from their berserking. So it's very easy to get healed and then have your whole thing get messed up. And then in some cases, it's also difficult to just drop your health. Like MC is a instance where it's very easy to drop your health, but it's not necessarily easy to drop it in some of the other instances. And, you can drop it with things like a Dark Rune, but once you get pretty geared, Dark Rune doesn't really do that much of a percentage of your health. So you can't really use them back to back, right? They have a 2-minute cooldown. So, you're not getting to 30% there, although you are gaining a bit over 10% after you use a Dark Rune. So there's all these kind of like factors that kind of come together that make it a bit awkward to use on Priest. The other thing is, a lot of times when you're going to want to be using the spell, is you're going to want to be using it to AoE heal, right? So you want to use it on something like Prayer of Healing when the raid's taking a lot of damage. And that can be a bit tricky because typically what happens when you're getting a lot of raid damage like that is it's hitting most or a lot of the raid. And as a priest, you have the Prayer of Healing spell, which heals you and the rest of the group, right? So typically you want the group's health to be in sync, right? That way you're all dropping at the same time. So when you press Prayer of Healing and it finally goes off, you all pretty much like recover at a relative rate. It's not going to be exactly the same because people have different HP values. But the problem is if you're sitting at 50% waiting to use this, right, and then big damage comes out, you can probably survive in most cases, but if something kind of goes wrong or something else like hits you that you weren't expecting, maybe a mob gets loose or something, it becomes very easy to die when you're just hovering 50% for quite a while in order to be able to use a cooldown, right? So there's certain instances where this has like a lot of potential and potentially even like really high potential. So it has like a really high potential upside, but in most cases it's just really awkward and difficult to use, and that's why I don't really value it very much, even as a player that excels in PvE content. Especially like if I'm going to play on a PvP server, like I'm definitely taking Will of the Forsaken over that any day, and Devouring Plague, not even close. So yeah, that's my thoughts on the Horde side. It's not anywhere near clear as cut. Like you won't get flamed playing either on Horde side. And as a matter of fact, I think like more people would, if you're playing on a PvP server, more people would probably rather you be undead if you're playing any form of PvP at all. So yeah, that's the racials. And let's move on to specs. So the first spec that I want to talk about is like, it's kind of going to be everybody's spec at the beginning, which is just going to be like a normal discipline spec. And we'll go to this, that's just right here. Actually, we have a couple extra points in here. Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, this is basically it. So this is like what you're going to be going to like around level 40 with, and in some cases you'll be going a little bit higher than this. Typically, you would, if you were going holy after this, you swap at 39. You can see we're at level 39 here. Or if you're going shadow, you could swap at 40, 41, or 44 are typically the 3 points, and we'll get into all of that in a second, but we'll kind of explain a little bit about this. So basically, we'll build this out from scratch, and I'll show you the order of the points and everything like that. So the first thing you want to put points in is a wand specialization. Now, there's some debate about if you want to do wand specialization or spirit tap, but wand specialization is just better as the first 5 points. And there's a couple reasons for that. The first one is basically that wands actually do a lot of your damage on priest, especially early. If I had a graph here, which I don't, but you can follow my cursor, basically the amount of damage your wand would do as a percentage of your overall damage would start out very high, like this, as your low level, and then as your level increases and you get more damage from other spells, it just continues to decline until 60, right? And that means that boosting your wand's damage early is really good because it's a larger percentage portion of your damage then, right? And then conversely, even though Spirit Tap is an amazing talent, you'll see that the real bonus of Spirit Tap is it doubles your spirit, right? And the big problem is that early game you don't have many stats. And in particular, I would say keep in mind you start getting talent points at level 10 or like 9 or something like that. It is, right? So when you put these first 5 points in, you're like 15, right? There's actually kind of a big difference between being level like 11 to 12 and being like, 17 to 18, 19 to 20. Like the amount of stats you can get on gear, because you have to keep in mind that you're counting each slot, right? So even if each individual slot only bumps up by maybe like 1 or 2 spirit, and in some cases it might actually be more than that if an item is spirit only, you're going to have that across multiple pieces of gear. So right at the start, you really don't have access to much spirit, but by the time you do 5 points in this and then 5 points in this and you're level 19, you'll actually have like, I wouldn't say a decent amount of spirit, but you'll have like significantly more spirit than, if you had put the points in here initially, right? So it's just more beneficial at that point. These are definitely 1 and 2. You want to get this one and then this one. So that's your first 10 points, but always put points in this first. People sometimes recommend splitting the points between the two. In my opinion, that's just bad. I think if you really wanted to have both active or to kind of like do some sort of split, the best thing you would do is put 1 point into Spirit Tap early and then put 5 points into Wand Specialization. And the reason for this is that Spirit Tap, if it does activate, you get 100% of the effect all the time. So as you notice, when we're putting points in, it's just increasing the chance that it activates, right? So having like 1 point in this is not like terror bad or anything at the start. It's just, again, it's not doing a lot for you because you don't have a lot of spirit. But yeah, I definitely wouldn't split points, whatever you do, or level this first. Definitely go Wand Specialization. Then after that, typically you'll get the Shadow Focus talent here. Now, Shadow Focus, a lot of people sometimes they see hit, they know hit's really valuable, they think I want 5 points in this. You really only need 2 or 3 points. If you're grinding, you can get away with like 2 points, in some cases even 1 point, but I would probably just recommend 2 points. If you're questing, 3 points is pretty decent. And the reason there's a little bit of a difference there is sometimes when you're questing, because of how the questing is in this game, it's not like super linear, like, oh, this quest is level 15 when you're level 15, this quest is level 18 when you're level 18. Sometimes you're going to have to fight things that are like a little bit higher than your level, especially if you use the Rested XP guide, which a lot of people do. So being able to hit against those things a little bit better is great, and having an extra point really helps you here in things that are like a level above you or so. So that's really good there. The next thing that I want to kind of talk about is improved Shadow Word Pain. So this is kind of a debated one, I guess, in terms of whether you want to put points in it or not. I'm going to explain a little bit about Shadow Word Pain and how it works in a relative sense, and that'll kind of better inform us on if we want to put points in this. So the truth about Shadow Word Pain, right? Everybody says this is like, it's like, the best dot in the game in this, and it is like really good, right? It's a super great dot, but you have to kind of contextualize things when you hear any type of information in this game, right? And usually what people mean when they talk about Shadow Word Pain being a great dot is that like they're talking about in a setting like where like you can just throw it up on a raid boss like Onyxia. It actually does like really good damage, like base damage wise, has a good duration, right? It's really good in PvP, things like that when you're getting like the full duration. Some people are also even accounting for having this allocated, right? The improved Shadow Word Pain. But in terms of leveling specifically, it's kind of a bit of a mixed bag, because if you are not getting the full 6 ticks of Shadow Word Pain, like the normal one on the mob, then it's basically like not even as efficient as Smite. It's basically around the same. It's a little bit more efficient than Smite if you're getting all 6 ticks, but even then it's not like a huge difference, right? So it really kind of depends on the mob you're fighting, the level difference, how quickly you're killing stuff. That being said, I like to put a couple points in this usually because it doesn't really delay the rest of what you're doing over here that much. And there can be use cases where this is actually, I would say, kind of good. And to really kind of extrapolate on that, I want to talk a little bit about the 2 different types of leveling, the 2 main types of leveling. We'll talk about dungeon leveling later, but the way I see it is you have questing, right, and then you have grinding, and sometimes you also mix these in between, like you'll quest for a portion of the game. Sometimes even if you're using a guide like RxP, it'll tell you to go grind for a little bit, and there's a little bit of a difference between these two, because even though you're killing mobs and stuff in both cases, when you're grinding, you're purely trying to maximize the amount of mobs killed per hour, basically, and it's not really the same when you're questing, because sometimes you're questing, you're up to a quest spot, you have to kill 8 mobs for these 8 items or something like that, but there's only 4 mobs spawned, you kill them, you have to wait. So basically, front-loading your damage a bit more when you're doing questing is usually more acceptable and fine, even if you're wasting some mana, right? So you can put Shadow Word Pain on the mob, and yeah, maybe you only kill it like a half a second faster, and it's not really worth the mana you spend, but to kill it faster at all is fine because you're never capped by your mana, right? Because you have to wait for respawns anyway, you're competing with other players, you finish the quest, then you have to run to another area to do another quest, right? So you're regenning along the way. So anytime where you have like interrupted gameplay like that, where you're going to have access to regen, then committing a bit more mana to kind of like overkill things is not really a problem. So it's not really that big of a deal. In the other case, you really do have to be careful when you're grinding in terms of how you're spending your mana, right? Because the idea is to keep killing as infinitely as possible. And in most cases, that is very possible on priests, like kill, 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 kill without having to drink. But in order to do that, you have to really be kind of scrupulous in terms of what you're spending your mana on and making sure you're getting like maximum value out of it. So if you're grinding and your pain is not getting full ticks, you don't want to use pain, right? But conversely, there can be some situations where even if typically you're not getting the maximum amount of ticks of your pain, there'll be some situations where you may want to cut out other spells and then use pain earlier where you will get the maximum amount of ticks. I'll kind of explain that right now. So when you're grinding, I have 2 concepts to keep in mind for you. There's mana positive and mana negative. And then there's kind of like also a mana neutral, but that one's kind of like sometimes hard to hit exactly, right? Most of the time you're going to be either mana positive or mana negative. What I mean by that is when you're doing a particular rotation to kill a mob, your mana is either going to be continually going down, right? Or it's going to be continually going up. And you might think it's weird that your mana might be going up as you're killing things, but it's because Priest is a very efficient killer because the wand does such a high percent of the damage. And when you're wanding and not casting, you're regenning. So that's why you're able to kind of benefit and kind of get so much regen back, right? But you'll have some scenarios where basically the more abilities you're using to kill a mob, the more likely you are to be mana negative, like losing mana per mob you kill, and then the less abilities you use, the more likely you're going to be mana positive. There'll be some situations where you can be mana neutral, you have a rotation, everything works out perfectly, you're going from mob to mob to mob, you're basically mana neutral, right? Most of the time that's not going to happen, so what you tend to do is you do the mana negative rotation at first, right, to spend mana, and then as your mana ticks down, once it gets low, you switch to the mana positive rotation, and that's something where something like Improved Shadow Word Pain can really come in handy, right? Because let's say you're doing your normal rotation, and you're kind of getting low on mana, so you take out like a Smite or you remove a Mind Blast, right? That's kind of a lot of damage you're removing. So if you supplement that by just allowing, putting the Shadow Word Pain on, right? Having the extra 6-second duration there, of it doing more damage for those extra 6 seconds is really huge. So I think there's definitely a lot of application in taking this, and most of the time I end up just taking it anyway. It's also good in PvP, right, if you're on a PvP server, so overall for me, most of the time I grab it. So that's the little spiel on Shadow Word Pain. Definitely a good ability, but just make sure you're not, like, you're not getting, like, 4 ticks, because there'll be some times where you're fighting monsters where you can kill them really fast, and you definitely don't need to use Pain. So just be aware of what you're doing, and save a bit of mana and you'll go a bit faster. So finishing off on this side, we'll put some points in here, right? And improved powered shield, improved powered fortitude, then inner focus and meditation. Inner focus is really nice because what this allows you to do is really cut your downtime once you get it, because what it actually does is it lets you completely ignore the 5-second rule. And what is the 5-second rule if you're new? So basically, if you've been casting recently, you have different regen than if you haven't been casting for 5 seconds. So your regen is less, basically. So it basically gets a penalty while you've been like chain casting. Then once you stop casting for 5 seconds, you get like your normal regen. You can think of it like that. And what Inner Focus does is, because it makes the spell that you're going to use it on cost no mana, and because the spell itself costs no mana, it actually counts as like you're not casting a spell. And that's really huge because it doesn't trigger the 5-second rule. So let me give you an example for how that can be useful, right? You're fighting a monster and you just kill it. You proc Spirit Tap, you've got all this extra regen, right? But you want to heal yourself because you're low. Well, if you heal yourself, you cut your regen, right? You basically you neuter it. It's not like you lose all of it, right? But you lose quite a bit of it. But sometimes you need to heal yourself, right? So if you use Inner Focus and then cast the heal, it's basically like you didn't cast anything at all. So 5 seconds after you leave combat with that monster, or 5 seconds after the last cast that you did, you're regenning the whole time, right? And you don't interrupt it by casting that heal at the end because it's cast with Inner Focus. So that's really, really huge, and it helps save quite a bit of mana overall. And you may be thinking well, yeah, but you're not going to have Inner Focus up for every heal because it's a 2-minute cooldown. But the thing is what we do is we shield ourselves before we pull the next mob. And what shielding allows you to do, I'm going to get into the rotation in a second, but the reason why we put a shield on first is because the mob is going to basically eat through the shield and do a little bit of our health damage by the time it dies. And that process is going to repeat 4 or 5 or 6 times until you're low on health. And the idea is that since you have a shield each time, you don't need to heal after every mob. You can heal once in bulk with Inner Focus and hopefully get a crit because it's 25% extra crit chance, and heal a large amount, basically heal your max health, and then go right into the cycle again, right? So there's actually really good synergy here with this Inner Focus talent and the 5-second rule and just how you do your rotation with shielding and stuff like that. So this is a really great thing to have. And to round this out, I usually like to put 1 point in Martyrdom, just in case, we need to heal on the fly after we've gotten crit or something like that. And put some points in here to reduce the shield cost. Put 1 more in here, and then put 1 more in here. If you only put 2 points in here, you'll have an extra 1, obviously, and then you'll be ready to transition to either Holy at 39 or the other spec at 40, 41, or 44, and I'll get into those in a second. I just want to cover the rotation you're going to be using as you're playing Disc. So basically, you're going to be shielding yourself, then going into Holy Fire, which is pre-casted, so you don't want to aggro the mob if it can be avoided before that. Then immediately casting Shadow Word Pain, then using Mind Blast, and then Wanding. Now, obviously, this rotation can be adjusted depending on the difficulty of what you're fighting. In some cases, you may find that you don't need to use Shadow Word Pain because you're not getting the maximum amount of ticks. In some cases, you may find that you want to put Shadow Word Pain on, skip the Mind Blast to recover a bit more mana, and just start wanding after the Shadow Word Pain. That's fine as well. So you have to play around with this rotation depending on what you're doing, whether you're grinding, questing, and like I said, if you're questing, don't be afraid to front load mana more, right? Because it's okay generally to do that, and it's less good to do that when you're grinding. And before you get Holy Fire, which I believe is around level 20, you can just open with a Smite, and yeah, that's pretty much the same rotation there. Just Holy Fire is a more efficient version, so we just replace it with Holy Fire once we get Holy Fire. And that is basically that. And now we will talk about Holy and Shadow, which you will go into after level 40. And basically the reason why we transition to these close to or shortly after level 40 is just because the key mechanics that are at play with both of them don't really kick in until then. So there's no point in kind of going down the Holy Tree first or going down the Shadow Tree. And before we actually pick a spell, we're going to go through them one by one, but I kind of want to talk a bit generally about Holy versus Shadow at first and explain a couple things, including like a few misconceptions. So obviously it makes sense that people think Holy is the healer spec, and they may be like, okay, well, why is this counted for a leveling spec if we're doing like solo leveling or we're doing questing or something like that, grinding? But Holy is actually a very viable leveling spec in terms of even no dungeons at all, just going into the world, questing, grinding, doing whatever, a mix. And there's a reason for that, and I will point it out right here. We'll go into, this is the Holy spec, and it's basically the spiritual guidance talent. And what it does is it converts 25% of your spirit into both healing power and spell damage. And spell damage is actually it's like particularly good on Holy because your main spells, which are Holy Fire that you're going to be using as well as Smite, actually scale really well with spell power, whereas Shadow spells scale very weak with spell power. For example, like I believe Mind Blast, which is like a primary Shadow spell, it's like 0.4 ratio coefficient. And I believe Mind Flay is even less than that. And to explain what a coefficient is, basically how spell power works in this game is if they basically figured out that if spell power or healing power affected every ability equally, right, it would be very much hard to balance because some abilities are like really strong, right, and like it would just be like kind of a mess. Like you don't want to instant heal or something that can scale with spell power 100%. So what they did is they made it so that every spell has a coefficient, and usually it's related to the properties of the spell, like how many people it hits, is it a dot, or is it a direct healing spell, what's the cast time on it. Usually it's related and correlated with those in some way. And basically, if you have 100 healing and you go to use like Smite, it goes and it gets multiplied by a 0.7 something ratio. So 70% of that damage, that spell damage gets applied. So you gain like 70 damage on the Smite as opposed to the full 100%. But like I said, on the Shadow spells, like Mind Blast and stuff, you tend to get less damage. Right? So this is a really crucial talent for Holy. And there's kind of a special synergy that happens with Holy when you do the Holy spec with Spirit Tap, because if you notice, most people are looking at Spirit Tap from a regen perspective, right? Which obviously makes sense because Spirit is tied to regen, and then you get 50% of your mana regeneration while casting. But when you have Spiritual Guidance, your spirit is also basically a weapon, right? It gets turned into spell damage for those 15 seconds. So your spirit basically gets doubled for those 15 seconds, which is huge. And, a lot of times you will be sort of chain killing. Like you're going to get at least a bit of use of the Spirit Tap augmented value of your spirit, so double spirit. And during those times, your spells are going to do more damage. And the good thing about this too is there's snapshotting in classic WoW. So what snapshotting is basically like a spell that has a dot component, something like Holy Fire, is going to do its damage based on what the spell power was of the person when it was casted. So all you need to do after you kill one mob is start casting Holy Fire on the next mob, and even if let's say you kill like 3 mobs and your Spirit Tap is about to run out, if you start your Holy Fire on the 4th mob and finish it before the buff goes away, then you get the augmented value of you get the extra spell power basically on your Holy Fire, so you're doing more damage. So it's really, really strong for Holy, and this is kind of like what allows Holy to compete with Shadow, and at least in terms of a direct 1-by-1 comparison in terms of killing mobs, like Shadow and Holy are not really that different at all. So that's basically the mechanic in terms of how Holy works. And then for Shadow, which we'll pop over to here, and then we'll go through the builds one by one in a second. Shadow mainly functions around Shadow form, and this makes you do 15% more damage, and you take less physical damage. So Shadow overall, what it's basically doing is it's making you like a more efficient mob killer, whereas Holy is kind of like you're getting a bit of burst damage. So Shadow is like we're trying to use as little mana possible to do like a maximum amount of damage, and we're not taking as much damage, and we're sometimes healing if we're using Vampiric Embrace on top of that, right? So we don't have to we recover a lot of our health that way. We don't actually have to heal ourselves, right? So we're using shields, things like Vampiric Embrace, natural regen, the fact that we're tankier in Shadow form, and then we're heavily relying on the dot of Shadow Word Pain, and then we're doing a little bit of a nuke with Mind Blast usually at the start of the rotation, and then we're using Mind Flay and Wanding to finish out the encounter. And we'll kind of get into this, like I said, in a couple seconds. But so we have one that's centered around kind of like efficiency and using very little mana, being tanky, not losing as much health. And we have one that's trying to like burst down mobs, essentially, before they can do a lot of damage to you. So it's kind of like the two philosophies at play. And they're both like very similar in terms of viability while just killing mobs. Personally, I would say if I was grinding and I was exclusively going to grind, I think Shadow is the better spec for like pure chain mob killing. But I actually think Holy tends to be the better questing spec because it allows you to front load damage more effectively, and questing most times favors being able to front load that damage like we were talking about earlier, right? It doesn't matter if you're a little bit more mana inefficient if you have a lot more time to regen that mana. So that's basically why I tend to play Holy, but we're going to get into these specifically. So let's look at I'm going to show you how to build them out individually, and then we'll look at their what they look like in a little bit of a higher level form. We'll show you the rotation on each. So for Holy, you're basically, we have to reset it. Yeah, okay. Thought something was a little bit off. So for Holy, we're coming down here, right? Grabbing this. This is something that, like, it's probably not going to be useful to you in most cases, but there's not, like, a super other great talent you can take. So I take it in case you need to AoE down some, like, little annoying things from time to time. I like to take Healing Focus here because it's just never bad to have this. And again, like, we don't have access to more damage yet at this point, right? We need more points to progress. So it's not really a big deal to take this. As far as the next 2 points, you can put them in Inspiration, Improved Renew, or Spell Warding, or Blessed Recovery, honestly. Any of these work. I honestly think, like, if you're doing more dungeon stuff, you put it in Inspiration. Blessed Recovery is actually pretty good as well. If you're just doing, like, pure leveling questing, right? Or grinding or questing. So I put 2 points into Searing Light, and then improved healing, right? And then we unlock this, which is where the juice is, spiritual guidance, 5 out of 5. And then you'll have 5 points in here. And keep in mind, you're going to be respecking at level 39, so you'll have points to get everything, because it's very important that you get Spirit Tap with this, right? Which is why we don't do the respec until 39. And then after that, you would basically go right into wand specialization next, okay? And to show you what the holy talents look like as you got more points into them, right? Again, we have the same thing here. I ended up putting the points in inspiration on this particular tree, but it's the same thing. You put the 5 points in here, then you put wand specialization, and then you basically go and you get inner focus, because like we talked about before, this is really good. You get meditation, which is really good, and you can keep putting points into this side of the tree. Now, in terms of, do you get any more stuff having to do with shadow? Not typically, because you're not really using a lot of shadow spells. In a lot of cases with Holy, we're going to talk about the rotation right now. You don't really use Shadow Word Pain a ton, although you can. But if you do, you're most likely not going to have the additional ticks on it, because like we said, Holy is kind of burst, right? So in most cases, I don't even bother to get Shadow Focus or Shadow Word Pain once we go over to Holy. I just go over to this to make the shield better, the other instance better. Put 5 points in here, then get Divine Spirit, because it's more spirit, right? And you would just finish out like that. You're also fine if you want to come down and get spiritual healing, but this talent in general is not really that good, and it's kind of only based on your healing, so it's only helping in terms of like dungeons and stuff like that, right? Whereas these have going down this route is a bit more of a general use case. So what is the rotation for Holy, right? So the rotation for Holy is Shield, and then we're going to go into a Holy Fire, and then a Shadow Word Pain maybe, depending on what you're fighting. Again, if you get the 6 ticks, you want to use it. If not, don't use it. And then you Smite, and then Wand. Now, you might have to add more Smites. How I would put the Smite to Wand ratio is basically like, again, like we talked about, right? At the start of the game, the wand is doing most of your damage, is a high percent of your damage, and then it trails off over time. So naturally, you have to supplement your damage with more spells, like as the game is progressing, as you're getting higher level. So I have Smite here into Wand, but it could really be Smite, or Smite. You're kind of just going to have to play around with that depending on the level you're at, depending on the mobs you're fighting, right? A lot of these things are situational. Generally speaking, you don't want to be like smiting to kill a mob. I'll put it that way, right? Like if your next smite is going to overkill a mob, you definitely don't want to use a smite there. You'd rather save the mana in most cases and finish it off with a wand, unless, like I said, you know you're going to be regenerating the mana after or something like that. So yeah, that's basically the rotation there. And then let's talk about Shadow. So I'll go over here to we'll actually build out a Shadow spec from scratch is what we'll do, and then we'll show you the other one just like we did here. Okay, so for a Shadow spec, 5 points in this. Probably put 3 points in that, 2 points in that, 1 point in Mind Flay, 2 points in this. We're going to put a couple points in Mind Blast. If you felt like you needed to fight like really higher level things, you could take the points out and put them in Shadow Focus. This 2 points in Mind Blast is kind of nice in my opinion, but it's not like crucial or critical, because Mind Blast is not like a huge part of your rotation. It's just kind of like a little bit of it's basically like your highest burst ability, and it's obviously on a cooldown, so you want to be able to you're basically just using it once anyway, right? So the cooldown reduction is not super helpful here typically, but it could be in certain scenarios, right? So whether you want to put the points in here or here is kind of up to you. Pragmatically, going up to 8-10% shadow spell hit, it's probably not going to help you in most scenarios at all. So that's why most people tend to just put a couple points and improve Mind Blast. 3 out of 3 Shadow Reach, right? Which will be kind of important. I'll explain the benefit of this when we talk about the rotation. We'll put 5 points in here. Usually put 1 point in the silence just to help in PvE, especially if you're on a PvP server. It's really good too doing PvP, but there'll be annoying mobs that will cast and stuff like that. Put a point in Vampiric Embrace, and then 5 out of 5 in Darkness, 1 in Shadow form. And then after this is what you have at level 40. And now I want to talk a bit about the 3 types, or the 3 spots where people tend to transition to Shadow that we talked about, right? So the first spot is level 40, right? This is obviously the first time Shadow form becomes available. It's the quickest you can get it. So you can obviously go Shadow form in here. There's really nothing wrong with transitioning at 40. It's just you're probably not like that much different or better than the discipline spec you were doing before. If you transition at 40, I would say. So just something to keep in mind there. Once you hit 41 and you're able to get the vendor wand that I'll show you when I get to the wand section, you're able to get a shadow wand basically. And that is the huge difference maker, because the shadow wand actually benefits, since it's shadow damage it's doing, from the shadow vulnerability you apply with shadow weaving. So your wand is doing 15% more damage, basically. Once you hit level 41, you're using a shadow wand. Now, I think the BFD wand is also shadow, but your BFD wand might be replaced by then. So, you could say that if you use this with the BFD wand, your wand's doing 15% more damage, but by that point, your wand is also probably a little bit under-leveled for your level. But you could still use the BFD wand. At this point in the game, it wouldn't be terrible until you hit level 41, you swap wands. So, yeah, that's typically why some people recommend 41. The reason why people recommend 44 is because Mind Flay is going to become a part of your rotation. And I think you get your first rank at Mind Flay at like 36 or 38 or something. And the rank 1 is not very good. The rank 2 you get at level 44, and it's much better than rank 1. And it's very, very noticeable. So some people recommend just waiting until 44. And if you wait till 44, not only do you get the Mind Flay, but you have 4 more points back in this, right? So you have now like a super strong wand that's doing 15% more damage here, 20% more damage here, and you have rank 2 Mind Flay. So this is where Shadow really starts to slay. But I guess what I would tell you is it really doesn't matter like when you swap that much, because you're not losing a ton of efficiency swapping at 40 versus 41 versus 44. The discipline spec is going to be still doing absolutely fine, whether you want to take it to 44 or swap right at 41 or 40. So I would swap at 41 or 44, but don't overthink this, right? It's not really that big a deal. Most of the time, it could actually be based off of when you end up getting back to a city to make the respec, right? Like I wouldn't, if you're in the middle of a long questing arc, I wouldn't, immediately hop on a thing and fly back to the city once I hit 41 or something like that, or once I hit 40 or so. I would plan it around that more than anything else, because the discipline spec holds up even a little bit into the low 40s. And now you want to talk about the rotation. So the rotation for Shadow tends to be shield, and then you're mind blasting, and then you'll use Shadow Word Pain sometimes again, and then Mind Flay, and then Wand. Now again, the Mind Flay here is kind of the same as Smite. As you get higher level, you may have to incorporate more Mind Flays. If your mana is low, you may rely on Shadow Word Pain more and use less Mind Flays and then transition to a wand. Something to note about Mind Flay is that it gets interrupted completely if you get hit. And this is the great thing about having a shield on Shadow, is that, well, you have a shield on all specs, but on the, shielding with Shadow in particular, is that you'll put the shield up, you'll Mind Blast, and then you'll either choose to use Shadow Word Pain or not, but then you'll immediately go into Mind Flay. And Mind Flay also slows, so usually the mob is not even hitting you by the time the first Mind Flay ends. If you're at max distance, for a lot of mobs, you can get, I think, 2 Mind Flays off without it making contact. It may make contact towards like the latter end of the second Mind Flay, But either way, you'll have a shield on yourself, so you won't get it interrupted. And you can even do like a third mind play if you need to. I'm not really sure about a fourth, but you could refresh your shield and then do a fourth if you needed to. So that's kind of like how you play around the, the mind play getting interrupted by hits, is that it slows, right? So that's helping you. Then the Shadow Reach is helping you because you get to start the fight off at a longer distance. So the mob has to close more distance, and you have the shield. And the shield kind of functions the same way with the Holy Spec, where obviously Smite doesn't get completely interrupted when something hits you, but it gets casting pushback. And the shield helps mitigate that because you don't get casting pushback while you're in the shield. So, for the Holy Spec, you would Holy Fire, Shadow Word, Pain if you want to, and then start casting Smite. And the mob is hitting you sooner than it would in Shadow because there's no slow on Holy, but you have the shield there that's protecting you, allowing you to keep tossing out your smites. Typically, if my shield fades when I'm playing the Holy Spec, that's a good signal to just go into Wanding. And usually the mob is low enough to kill anyway. Like, you don't really want to be trying to cast Smite when you don't have a shield on yourself and you're getting spell pushback, because then it just becomes like inefficient because your wand doesn't get pushback. Keep in mind. So, if you ever lose your shield, you want to pretty much transition to Wanding in most cases for either spec, unless you can just put another shield up if you want to do that. So that is basically the rotation there. And so overall, which one do I prefer? I tend to go Holy all the time. I think I mentioned that already, but the main reason, and I kind of wanted to expand about why I really like Holy, is the flexibility it has. I'll be honest, Shadow can heal pretty much anything in the game. You obviously don't want to be Shadow when you're raiding in the end game, but up until the end game, realistically, you can heal most things in the game as Shadow. However, I would say that once you hit around level 53, once you maybe get into that, you're starting to do lower level dungeons, which can give you some pre-bis, like BRD, stuff like that, it becomes a little bit harder to heal them with Shadow. It's just not quite as efficient, and Shadow is never going to be as efficient as Holy pretty much ever, and it's not going to feel as good to heal things as. And when I talk about feel, I mostly talk about this spell right here, Divine Fury. I'll reset here and just put a couple points in here. But there's a couple reasons why I really like healing things as Holy, and therefore why I like the flexibility that playing Holy while leveling gives me, because I can level quest at basically similar speeds to Shadow. Maybe questing potentially even a little bit faster. If I have to grind a lot, I'm a little bit slower. Even if overall I'm a little bit slower leveling in the normal game as Shadow, if I do dungeons, I'm way more efficient as Holy. And there's a couple reasons why. So the first is you're getting stuff like Healing Focus. So anytime something kind of goes on you that isn't getting tanked for some reason, which happens all the time in random dungeons, you can still get most of your heals off with minimal pushback, right? It doesn't eliminate all your pushback, but it's way better than not having this if you're a Shadow. The other thing is having 5 points in here. Similarly, imagine you're like a Shadow Priest, right? And you're trying to heal ZF, and you're getting, mobs peeled off the tank. Maybe he got something pulled by accident or something, right? They're hitting you. You're trying to get heals out on yourself and other people. You're getting pushed back. You don't have Healing Focus, and you have a 0.5 second longer cast time on Heal and Greater Heal, right? It's not going to feel fun. The difference between when both of these are acting in your favor versus neither of them acting in your favor is huge. And that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the feel, right? This is just going to make your tank tankier if you do take this option. You don't have to, but like I said, it's pretty good. This can honestly even be useful in some dungeon scenarios. You don't really want to be using this or spamming this at all. Don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to be a super Holy Nova advocate, but there'll be some situations where you'll have very low mobs and your mage is out of mana or something like that, or it's it's kind of really cutting it close, And Holy Nova heals the people around in the melee while also doing damage to the mobs. So it can actually be quite good in some situations. It's just something you want to use very sparingly, and you have to kind of know the situation. You have to recognize the situation to use it. It's always good though. And you'd put points in here. Then this is just obviously strictly better heals. But also, Spiritual Guidance is really good. And why is Spiritual Guidance good? Well, similarly to how the Holy Damage spells have good spell power scaling, the Holy Healing spells also have pretty decent spell power scaling. So what that can allow you to do is to downrank spells, right? So you don't have to use the highest versions. You're still getting a good amount of plus healing because you're getting plus healing from your spirit, right? And yeah, so it's just I would say like a very noticeable difference doing dungeons as the Holy Spec versus the Shadow Spec. Like, you're absolutely going to be able to do them as Shadow. Like, that's not what I'm trying to say, but it's just going to feel better for you and your group, and you're going to progress through the dungeon faster. You're going to have more mana if you go Holy Spec. So that's why I like being Holy, and then I can heal dungeons whenever I want, and then I can heal, or I can just quest and grind whenever I want as well, right? So that's what I tend to prefer. And let us get into... Oh, one more point I want to mention about that, actually, is around, I would say, like level 50, kind of like the low 50s, high 40s, right? This is kind of the start of the game where I feel like the end game really begins in Classic WoW. People say it begins at 60. For a Priest, it begins about level 49, I would say, because that's the level you kind of start to get into first part of BFD groups and stuff like that. And I would highly recommend, even if you're like, just a normal leveler or something like that, like questing or grinding, this is the spot where you kind of want to break away and get into dungeons, because your Priebus comes from BFD or BRD, and even though you only have access to kind of like the first parts of it when you're kind of like lower 50s, it's still nice, really good for experience. And it's nice to be able to get those pieces as you're getting experience, right? And early on, like I would say level 49 to like 54, 55, BRD is really good for experience. Especially we're going to talk about some of the dungeon groups down below. But even with like a normal dungeon group, as long as they're capable of killing the mobs at a reasonable pace, it's very, very good for experience. And then even as you get higher, like 55 plus, like let's say a lot of people will transition to full BFD runs at that point, or they'll go deeper and deeper in. Maybe they won't go all the way to the end, but they'll keep kind of like going deeper inside. And even if your experience is not quite as good at that point, and you're maybe faster, like leveling in the world or something like that, you're acquiring tons of Priebus or Priebus adjacent items from BRD, because there's a lot of your Priebus in BRD, and there's not only a lot of Priebus, but there's a lot of stuff that's like very close to Priebus and stuff like that, and just generally useful for you. So you're kind of killing two birds with one stone, and that is by far the most efficient way to do the last levels, in my opinion. Obviously, do what you want. If you like questing, that's fine. If you like grinding, that's fine. But in terms of like raw efficiency, it doesn't really get better than hitting up BFD and then other instances as you kind of like start getting closer to the max level. So just another reason why I really like the Holy Spec, I guess, because it allows you that like flexibility around those levels, which is really nice. So let's get into wands. Now, a lot of people, if you go to like a Reddit thread and you search wands, you'll just see like database posts with like every wand in the game. There's really like 4 wands that are very obvious to anybody who's ever played priests that are really good, right? There's the Lesser Magic Wand, which is insane for its level. It just does ridiculous damage. There's a Greater Magic Wand. These are both crafted. I can make a video on how to craft these separately, but they're very easy to get a hold of for most. It really depends on kind of like your race and where your character starts, because they require cloth, which comes from humanoids typically. But in most cases, it's pretty easy to get them. And even if you're one of the races that has like a worse start, you only get it like a couple levels after. It's not like you're without this for like 10 levels or something. So these wands are both really good. And then the next one is the Gravestone Scepter. This is from BFD. This wand is just ridiculous. It's basically like a level 19 wand that has the stat budget of a level 40 wand, or like maybe a little bit less than 40. It's really, really good. Not much else to say there. You're probably going to end up getting it around level 23, 24. You probably want your group to maybe a little bit higher level than that. You can kind of, whenever you're dungeoning on a priest, you can afford to be kind of like a little bit lower level because you're just healing. You don't have to hit mobs or anything. So, yeah, definitely keep that one in mind. You want to go out of your way to get that one, in my opinion. You don't want to go out of your way so much where like you're sitting at the instance doing nothing, like waiting for a group, but you want to be an LFG. You want to be like, as you're running from quest to quest, you want to be trying to find a group because it's a huge power spike, and you can get other wands along the way to kind of like make up the difference, but you're definitely going to be losing time if you don't get the BFD wand. And the dungeon is like, there's quests in there and stuff like that. It's not bad to just do one run through. The wand comes from a quest, so you get the wand, you get other quest XP, you get kill XP. It's not bad to do the dungeon at least once at all. You definitely want to do it. And then the wand at level 41 that I was talking about is the Blackbone wand, the Shadow wand. There's also like Umbra wands at level 40, which sometimes, depending on if you're like not, if you're kind of a little bit behind, you might be able to pick one of those up from the auction house, and they have stats on them as well, so they're a little bit better probably than the Blackbone wand, which I think is actually a white wand, but we only really care about the wand DPS, so that's fine. And that's like the last major wand, because after that, you're basically just using whatever you can find. And like I said, realistically, around like level 49, you kind of want to be focusing more on endgame stuff, typically as a priest anyway, right? So it doesn't really matter about upgrading your wand so much because you're not really doing damage at that point, right? And yeah, so that's basically the wands that you want to target, I would say. And what dungeons do you want to do? So I think even if you're a player that's like not planning on dungeon spamming or something, these are some dungeons that are always really good XP and are always like really good to do. BFD, obviously, you do it once for the wand and then other quests and stuff like that. Scarlet Monastery, you can start this probably as like 29 as a priest because you can be a lower level than the other classes. You can go all the way to like 40, I think 3 here, 44 if you wanted to. You could do nothing but spam SM. Has some good loot in here for priests. Some of the stuff is like better than other stuff. It's like not all amazing, but it's a lot better than gear you're just randomly going to find questing and stuff for the most part. So definitely some good gear opportunities. ZF is another one. Like you could basically go SM like 29 to like 44, 43, and then ZF 43, 44 to 53. I think it stops giving XP around 53, like the main parts, but yeah, and you can do ZF even earlier than that on a priest, because again, you don't need to be hitting mobs. You just want to make sure your group is like probably close to mid 40s. If your group isn't that high level, you can still kind of like do the graveyard part of ZF, as well as like the earlier parts, and then just not do the later parts. So you can do stuff like that as well. And then you can basically go right into BRD after you finish ZF. And BRD is obviously really great because we just talked about that. All the gear comes from there. Even if you're only doing the first part, there's still like a decent amount of like caster gear, which may not be pure BIS, but is like BIS adjacent for you. And then you can keep doing BRD all the way through, or you can do LBRS, which also has some decent stuff in there. Or, you can even do like, as a priest, you can do stuff like Strat or UBRS. The higher level dungeon you go, especially if you're lower level in comparison to the people you're with, just be careful about aggroing stuff, and you may want to kill more things because dungeons like Strat and stuff, the mobs are higher level. So naturally, they'll have bigger aggro radiuses. And if you're playing with like level 60s or something, and you're a little bit behind the curve, you may be aggroing stuff. And that's the only disadvantage of being a lower level in there. Like, in terms of like your usefulness, you're gonna be fine at level 58, but you just have to be careful about aggro and stuff. So, dungeon spec. So here we're gonna be talking about like the different types of dungeon groups you can go into, and then I'll give my dungeon spec, and then we'll talk about doing damage in dungeons, right? So basically, we'll start with the spell cleave, which I think is by far the best type of run for a priest. Like if you want just pure leveling efficiency, typically a spell cleave is 4 mages and 1 priest. Now you can substitute some things in, so you can have like 3 mages, a warlock, right? You could probably even do 2 mages, 2 warlocks. I think realistically you tend to want like 3 mages. It makes things really smooth, but you can obviously adapt this to have multiple things. And basically how it works is like the mages just like rotate pulls with ice block. The other mage is a blizzard off the ice block, which takes the aggro away, so the other mage can then rejoin the fight safely. And you just AoE the mobs down with blizzard. When they get close, you can Nova them if you want, or just kind of like step back and recast. Some mages can drop Flame Strike when they're low. They can Arcane Explosion the remaining ones, etc. So a lot of times what will happen is like one mage will be... The mages that use mana like early will be drinking. Then another mage will be pulling. That mage is pulling while the other mages are drinking, and then they'll ice block. The other mages will pull the aggro off and stuff like I was saying. And it's just like a clean rotation. Then the next guy goes in and uses his ice block. And it's just very, very easy leveling. And this goes all the way up to basically BRD. The only thing is like you're not doing the whole part. You're not doing like the whole BRD with 4 mages and 1 priest. Like you're basically just sitting in the early part and farming it. But the XP for that is like insane because mages just destroy that first part of the dungeon. So you end up just like leveling so fast if you do that. It's like the best pure raw leveling method for a priest, I would say, is to like join up with mages in that way and do a dungeon cleave. The disadvantage to doing a dungeon cleave like that is that you don't have a tank. So you're kind of like ahead of everybody else level wise, but the tanks are like all behind you, right? And people who are leveling in their own other groups already have their tank, so you're kind of reliant on like tanks that come through leveling solo or just questing and stuff like that, which can sometimes tends to take a little bit longer, right? But it can also be easy finding a tank when you do find one, because every tank wants in like a 3 mage group, right? And you could just rotate out the 4th mage for every couple dungeons or something like that. But because they're going to get all the loot, essentially, you'll have warriors that aren't even like really tanks that will tank your dungeons because they know they're getting all the tank gear and all the DPS gear, right? So finding tanks shouldn't really be a problem like once people start to catch up a bit. But obviously you won't necessarily have a tank like right when you cap necessarily, so you can kind of just do other things, I guess, until tanks kind of get up there. Another way to solve this problem is you run the 3 mages, 1 warrior or 1 bear or whatever, so you already have your tank kind of like built into the group, and losing 1 mage isn't really the end of the world. And in some cases this can even be smoother because again you can just transition into kind of doing the full dungeons earlier, right, because you leveled up a tank with you. So that's obviously like a strategy there. And that pretty much is the spell cleaves. Your melee cleave is typically a priest and like 4 warriors, or if it's horde it can be 3 warriors, a shaman for Wind Fury, is typically the case. Less important on the alliance side, it'll be sometimes 3 warriors and a paladin for might, but typically having the shaman in the group on the horde side is the real difference maker. And the melee cleave is it's fine. It really picks up, I think, around kind of like the Scarlet Monastery levels when you get Wood Fury, and when you have access to these abilities like Whirlwind and stuff like that, and you start getting better weapons. Like some of the warriors will have their Warrior Quest weapon. They may have the Ravager from Scarlet Monastery. So that's where, like, when you start getting more hit, better weapons, access to kind of like all your abilities, that's where the melee cleave group really starts to kind of like pop off. But before that, it'll feel significantly worse than the spell cleave. It'll feel more like just an average group, basically. But then once you kind of get everything working, it'll be a nice middle ground between the spell cleave, which is just the absolute best, and the average group. Average group is obviously just like kind of like a mix mash of classes, which is going to be like your worst performing group. However, I will say that even if you're just in like an average group doing dungeons, you're probably, as long as you're like mindful, like the people are playing efficiently, they're playing well, and they're trying to push the pace, you will have a faster leveling experience than if you were in a like if you were leveling solo, basically, right? Either questing or grinding. My 2019 classic group was actually like mage, rogue, 2 warrior, priest, which is not really that ideal, because it doesn't really fully fit into like any identity super well. And but we still did a good job, so it wasn't really like an issue anyway. Like group leveling is still probably best for the priest, unless you have like a bad group. If you have like an average group composition but good players, it's going to be fine, and it's going to be faster than grinding or questing, or doing the grinding questing combination. So that's kind of like my thoughts on the kind of dungeon groups. I'll do the dungeon spec here, like if I was going pure dungeon spec. So this is going to depend a little bit on what group we're talking about. So let's say we're talking about I'll say spell cleave, okay? So on spell cleave, I may be a bit more hesitant to get spirit tap. At the beginning, getting spirit tap with a spell cleave is fine, but as you get towards the end of the game, keeping spirit tap in general towards the end of the game is a little bit tough when you're doing dungeoning, because again, your damage really falls off in general compared to the actual damage classes, right? So the issue you run into is like you actually have to kill the mob to proc this, and it becomes very difficult to ensure that you're killing the mob, because right off the bat, if you were entering in at like Dead Mines level 18, right, you can just start wanding something that's kind of low and probably kill it, or maybe you can execute it with a Mind Blast. You can proc this relatively easily, but it's going to take like multiple Mind Blasts to kill stuff that's like in the 30s. It's going to take like, you're just not going to kill stuff with a Mind Blast probably in the 40s or 50s, unless it's like perfectly low for you. It's going to take a lot of wand hits to kill stuff as they get higher. So getting this to reliably proc is difficult when you're, especially if you're not having really good cooperation from your team. So especially in pugs, this is hard to get like a lot of use out of, or if the mages are just killing everything so fast that you can't really land a kill, then it's not really that good. But it's definitely an option to look into, especially earlier on. You can always spec out of it later when it becomes too hard to proc, right? So let's say we'll do a build where we use this, right? And then I would do something like this. 2 points in there. We'll put points in here. Put a point in there. Probably put a third point in here, honestly. And then maybe here. If I was just going pure dungeon, I'd put points in here. Probably put another one in here. And maybe even put points in renew, or probably 2 points in renew. Hold on. Yeah, I'd put 2 points in renew. And then spiritual guidance. right? And then I would start filling out this, and you could, if you dropped this, right, then you just have the extra point. I would still put points in the wand specialization just because this is not like super great and you're not going to really need this in most cases. And I would fill out like this, and then this is your basic core. Like if you have this when you're kind of like about to get into BRD or whatever, like this is what I'd respect to basically by the time I kind of got into like the higher level dungeons, and you'd pretty much be all set and good to go there, right? And then yeah, by the time you have this, you're basically like almost leveled completely. So yeah, it's that's what I would do for like pure dungeon. It's not really that much different, as you can see from the holy damage spec, which is why you're able to, you basically just put points in this instead, right? And that's why the holy damage spec is so good, because it's basically it's a completely viable on par spec with Shadow for the other types of leveling, and it's just basically very close to the optimal dungeon healing spec. So that's what I would do for the pure dungeon spec. And healing in dungeons is damage in dungeons is the last thing I have here. And I just wanted to cover this because if you've played like retail or even retail adjacent things, like I know a lot of people were dungeon grinding in Wrath of Lich King to get max level there, and the healers are kind of doing damage. Healers doing damage in Classic is like pretty much not a thing, especially when you're doing dungeon leveling, in my opinion. You have maybe a bit more flexibility if you're running a pure spell cleave group, because you're not going to have to do that much healing, and you can sometimes kind of join in finishing off mobs with the Holy Nova shenanigans. You're kind of like wasting mana, but as long as you're not the person that everyone is waiting on to get mana back, then it's fine. But if you're ever like slowing your group down because you're using Holy Nova too much to like finish off packs or something, you want to stop that, because the mages don't need more damage in most cases, right? So yeah, typically it's not really that good for you to be doing damage. Even like I'll see some people, they want to be active, right? So they'll be casting Shadow Word Pains, right? Trying to multi-dot and stuff like that. And that would be probably really good in retail. But in Classic, it just really hurts you because your mana regeneration is kind of like so poor in general. It's really scarce. So you need to maximize it by abusing that 5-second rule, right? So a lot of times in dungeons, you want to be sitting there doing nothing, to be honest. Or basically wanding is the equivalent of doing nothing, right? Because you want your 5-second rule to kick in and get more mana back, because even if you don't need the mana for this pull, having a bigger mana battery overall will allow you to pull more and more and more before you have to stop and actually drink, right? So anything that's basically doing damage is hurting you, not only in the sense that you're not doing a lot of damage because your spells mostly suck. Also, a lot of the times, especially if you're the lower person in the party, like lower level, but even if you're not, you don't have a lot of hit in a lot of cases for some of these spells. Like maybe some of your shadow spells will have a bit of hit, but your holy spells won't. So that means that you're missing a lot. So you're not doing very much damage, you're missing a lot, and you're griefing your regen because you're casting spells when you could otherwise just be sitting there and regenerating mana, right? So it's a little bit counterintuitive because, in retail there's like that always be casting thing, right? But that's really just kind of based off of a version of the game where you just have a lot more access to mana, and mana is a lot less of an issue, and that's not really the case in this version of the game. So you really want to stretch your mana, and you have to be patient. You have to choose when you want to cast, and like in general, you shouldn't even really be pampering your tank a ton in dungeons. Like you don't want to let him get super low, obviously, but there's no need to like put his health back to full when he hits 95%. You can like wait a little bit, especially if it's obviously one thing if you have full mana, but if you have not full mana, then waiting a little bit to get a little bit of, get a tick here, a tick there is never really a bad thing as long as you're not putting the tank in danger. So yeah, that's the type of stuff you want to be focusing on when you're dungeon leveling. You really don't want to be focusing on doing damage outside of wanding. Obviously, wanding is fine because it doesn't trigger the 5-second rule or anything like that. But yeah, you don't want to be dotting. You don't want to be smite spamming, generally speaking, because down the road that mana will probably always be more useful, where you can just kind of go and go and go and not have to stop ever. And you will have to stop if you're spamming Shadow Word, Pain, and Smite. So, yeah. But that's pretty much it. I think I covered basically everything. My voice is a little shot by the end of this video, but it's okay. Thank you guys so much for watching. Like I said, this is a long one, but it'll have timestamps. So, yeah, just go through it, pick out what you need. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments, and I will do my best to answer them. I will also probably start streaming. I will be streaming, by the way, so you can ask me questions on stream as well. I'll probably start streaming at least a couple days maybe before launch, I think. Maybe I'll do some like hangout sessions where people can come in and ask questions if they want. But yeah, if you have questions in the interim, feel free to leave them in the comments and I will get to them. Thank you guys so much for watching. And yeah, really looking forward to next week and more videos to come.